Hey, what's up guys? Tanoy Senha here with another D3 playthrough. It took a few hours today to analyze some of the mechanics in the game because I had a few interesting questions that I wanted to ask. The first was, or ask and answer. The first was, which of these skills should I be using, Lashing Tail Kick or Tempest Rush? Next was, should I be dual wielding, two of these weapons, or should I be using kind of one two-handed weapon? And the last was, do I need more armor, or should I be getting things like dexterity or some other stats and sacrificing armor for that? And in order to do that, I had to kind of model out what some of the things in the game did, what some of the stats did, and I found this tab super, super useful. There are a lot of pretty in-depth stats on this tab that I tried to figure out if I could model. So let me take you through what I did. I used a little spreadsheet to get most of this stuff done. And the first thing that I started with was armor. And what I essentially did was I looked at this number here. This Templar. Yeah, alright, Templar, keep it down. So I basically had all these armor values that I have equipped, and I had this damage reduction percentage. So I decided to get rid of some of the armor. And I would figure out what the new damage reduction percentage was, and I would just write all that down. So 107 to 17.63%. I took a bunch of these values and I plotted them on a graph, which is down here. And these were the values that I had listed, and these were the empirical damage reduction percentages that I found. And what was clear from the plot is that there were diminishing returns to damage reduction, which was pretty straightforward. It's something that I expected. If you gained a linear amount of damage reduction from armor, pretty soon you could mitigate all incoming damage. So they have to make it so that armor gets less and less valuable as you add more of it to your body. Otherwise, you'll just become invulnerable eventually. So you can see here at a very low armor value, my damage, the amount of armor that I needed to add to get an additional 1% of damage reduction is something like 5. As I got up to 115, it became something like 6. So it's just indicating it's taking more and more armor for me to get 1% damage reduction. So what I did was, World of Warcraft is also another Blizzard game, and they're pretty experienced at creating armor systems. Blizzard is, but I figured they had a good one from World of Warcraft, so I kind of assumed that they might be using the same one in Diablo 3 to start. And the way that the World of Warcraft armor system works is that they take the armor value and they divide it by the armor value plus a constant. And so that means as your armor value tends to get very high, it needs to get very, very high, and then you can get to 100% damage reduction, but this constant makes it harder. It gives you diminishing returns. This constant is usually determined by your level and the enemy who is attacking you, that enemy's level. And just for my particular guy, level 10 monk, I just put in a bunch of numbers and it looked like 500 was a number that works. So the way they're calculating the damage reduction based on the number of armor points that I have is using this formula. They take the armor, they divide it by the armor plus 500, and they multiply by 100 to get the percentage. And that seems to be working for all these values. And then I went and I put in a couple other values, 200, 300, 400, just to see what my damage reduction might be if I ever got up to those levels. So that's this graph that you can see here. And you can see it's gradual, but there's definitely diminishing returns here. So that's cool. Now, I get damage reduction from armor. So if I have 133 armor, I'm going to get 21% damage reduction. But I also get damage reduction from dexterity because of this dodge. So I'm assuming that a dodge is just basically 3.9% of the time. I just don't take any damage. But the way that I believe damage reduction... actually, I'm not really sure now that I think about this. The way that I think damage reduction is supposed to stack is linearly. Actually, I'm just now thinking about this, and this might be wrong, but not linearly, but geometrically. If damage reduction stacked linearly, like for example, if I have this skill here, 25% damage reduction for 2.5 seconds. If it stacked linearly, then I could probably get to 100% damage reduction very quickly. Probably doesn't stack linearly, and I looked it up in the forums online, and they mentioned that this damage reduction stacked geometrically, which means that you take 1 minus this number, and you multiply it. You gotta put these guys in parentheses, be a good mathematician. You multiply it by this number, and you should get, the overall damage reduction, which is what I did right here. 1 minus You know, these things multiply together geometrically. Now, that would mean that dodge is a strict damage reduction skill, so that means that it actually reduces incoming damage by 3.9% instead of, you know, the way a dodge typically works is somebody tries to attack you and they just miss. So I don't know how dodge works actually, but I'm assuming that it works like damage reduction and not like what a dodge would look like. So that's interesting. But assuming that that's true, I can kind of get a sense of how much damage reduction, you know, dexterity can give me using these little fields here. These fields, so like I have armor right here. If I give myself 10 armor bonus, like if I put an item on that gives me more armor, I can show what the armor is, you know, 143, and what my damage reduction would be there, and I can start to see, you know, what, you know, how these two stats relate to each other. So what I did, you know, the number that I'm looking for here is the amount of dexterity that I need to increase my damage reduction by 1%. That number is around 12. So we're looking right here is 25%, 24, 25, 24, 25. It's about 12 dexterity for me to go 1% more in damage reduction. Even if that's not how dodge works in terms of damage reduction stacking, it would be 10, you know, dexterity, you know, assuming this formula is wrong. But I'm assuming this formula is right, so it's about 12, 10 or 12. And for armor, the corresponding value would be 8. So if you look here, this is 8, and I go from 24 to 29, right there. So it takes less armor for me to get a 1% damage reduction than dexterity. And then, you know, that's not the whole story. You have to figure out how hard it is for me to get dexterity. You know, if you have an item of a given level, you know, maybe that item, you know, if it's like a level 10 item or something, it'll give you 3 dexterity or it'll give you 20 armor. You know, dexterity and armor don't have like a 1-to-1 correspondence. So it seems like getting dexterity is actually a little bit harder than getting armor. So armor is actually going to be even more important when I'm thinking about raw damage reduction, just because dexterity is so hard to get, and point for point it's not as good as armor when it comes to damage reduction. So that's that story. Armor, better than dexterity for survivability. The question is, do I need to worry about the damage output that dexterity gives me as well? Like this thing right here, it's 18 armor versus 36 armor. Clearly my Brigandine code is better from damage reduction standpoint, but the dexterity here is a wild card. I don't know how much damage it's going to give me. So now I got to start modeling damage, and this is also going to help me answer the question of, you know, dual wield versus two-hand, what kind of skill should I be using? So first things first, I have this number here, damage, 20.74 damage per second. That's the number Blizzard is telling me. So I'm going to see if I can match that, you know, based on some calculations, and I was able to. So if I go here, I have this crazy set of stats, but I'll walk you through them all. This line is the model for the two-handed weapon that I have here, the Keen Short Staff of Wounding. So what I did is I took the base damage, so you see it says 11 to 17 damage. I basically took the average of that and called that the base damage. This means it's going to do 14 damage every time I smack somebody with it. Then I have to figure out how my crits work. So if I have a 5% chance to crit, it says, and I do an additional 50% bonus damage with each crit. So if I add those in, then I get, adding crit, I get 14.35 damage every time I whack somebody. And then I have dexterity, and dexterity says that all my damage is increased by 39%. So I just increase this damage by a flat 39%, and I get my total damage of 19.94. There's a whole bunch of stuff I put in here for kick. We're going to ignore that for now. Now I'm going to put in the actions, or attacks per second. So this is 1.04 attacks per second. So if I whack somebody for 19 damage, and I do it every 1.04 seconds, my damage per second is 20.744, which is the number that I get here. So it seems to be working for that weapon. Let's try for another one. Masterwork Cudgel. It's a one-handed weapon. 7 to 14 damage. That means it's 10.5 base damage, I guess. Yep. Attacks per second is 1.2, which is right here. And my weapon damage is 17.95. So it works. Great. Now what I need to do is figure out how dual wielding works. So I put in a dual wielding weapon here. Let's put in this guy, 11.2. So this, now it says that my damage goes up to 19.58. How are they calculating that? Well, what happens when you dual wield is you have these two weapons, and Blizzard assumes, or Diablo 3 assumes that you're going to attack first with one of the weapons, and then second with another one of the weapons. So this is a cudgel attack, that's a knuckle attack, cudgel attack, cudgel, knuckle, and you guys get the point. So how does that work? Well, first off, I get a flat attack speed bonus because I'm dual wielding. I get a 15% bonus to my attack speed. So my attacks per second goes up by 15%. And then it alternates my attacks between the two weapons. So if I have the base damage of 8 for this guy, does 4 to 12 damage, it gets 1.4 attacks per second. I get the 15% damage bonus. So that means I'm doing attack every I'm getting 1.6 attacks per second instead of 1.4. Then I can start to calculate my DPS. And you can see here in the details, it tells you what your attacks per second are. And it only shows you the main hand attack speed. So don't have anything, 1.2 is my attack speed. Put this guy on, it's 1.38. And that is the 15% flat bonus from the 1.2 going to 1.38 here. So that's what it's doing. And it shows you the main hand. So if I go make this guy my main hand, I get 1.4 attacks per second. Go here, I do a wheel 1.61. And that's the number that I get right here. Couple of interesting things. Well, actually, let me go ahead and show you the full DPS calculation. In order to get my combined DPS, this 19.58 number, I take the damage that I do when I whack somebody with my, cudgel, and the damage that I do when I whack somebody with my knuckles, and I take the number of seconds it takes for me to make that attack. If I get 1.38 attacks per second, the inverse of that is 0.72 seconds per attack. So I whack somebody for 15 every 0.72 seconds, and then I whack them again for 11 every 0.62 seconds. If I add the first two numbers, blood ow, and I divide by the second two numbers, blood ow, I get my DPS, 19.585. That's how they're calculating that. Now, a couple of interesting things. This guy says plus 1 to 3 poison damage. I don't model that anywhere here. I don't have any column for poison damage. But I get the same number that they're saying. That indicates to me that their DPS doesn't take into account poison. Because if this poison damage is true... Alright, Templar, seriously, knock it off. 1 to 3 poison damage. That's an average of 2 poison damage, right? And I do 1.4 attacks per second, so theoretically I should get another 2.8 DPS from that, right? But that's not listed anywhere in this number because I calculated it and I didn't list it. So that's interesting. Another interesting thing is that if you have an increased attack speed on a weapon, that doesn't apply to your character. So I put in this guy here, right? I can model this guy, it does 3 to 9 damage, 1.47 attacks per second. So I make this base damage 6. I make this guy 1.47. Blood ow. And I should get, I got to add in dexterity, so I got to give myself 3 dexterity bonus. And I get 18.24. I did not model this increased attack speed. Keep that in mind. I don't have increased attack speed anywhere here. And I still got the right DPS calculation. It's because Diablo 3 takes that increased attack speed and applies it only to the weapon that you have. So, a Knuckles generally attacks 1.4 attacks per second. If I increase the attack speed by 5%, I get 1.47. That's this number right here. So 1.4 times an additional 5% attack speed, that's 1.47. It applies only to this knuckle, not to this cudgel. The dexterity, on the other hand, applies to my character, so I get that bonus for my entire character. I imagine if there's a ring that gives me an increased attack speed, it would apply to both weapons, but I don't have one of those yet, so I can't verify that. Also, if you keep in mind this guy right here, the staff, it says plus 1 to 3 damage. That is not modeled anywhere in the DPS calculation. So I actually don't know if, this is interesting, I don't know this, and I don't know this here either, actually. Maybe that 1 to 3 poison damage is in the 4 to 12 damage that it says right there. It might be that. I don't know. I would need to hit a monster to find that out, actually. So that's interesting. So maybe what's happening is that this 19.58 number is true, and the poison damage is included in the base damage of this weapon. So I don't know that. But if it's not, then I would have to add in that poison damage. And the same thing here. I would have to add in this plus 1 to 3 damage if that's not reflected in that 11 to 17 number, right? So the next thing that I have to do is I have to figure out how much damage my kick does, because or my skill does, because I'm going to be using the skill, right? I'm generating spirit. I should be consuming that spirit to do more damage. The Tempest Rush, it snares. It doesn't tell you this in the game, but you can look it up on the Battle.net website. Tempest Rush does 50% weapon damage to a unit, and it slows that unit by 60% for 2 seconds. So, Tempest Rush, and then the Lashing Tail Kick and the Vulture Claw Kick specifically does 220% weapon damage on an attack. So it does way more damage than Tempest Rush. So Tempest Rush is more of a utility skill. It's when I need to snare something. but the vulture claw kick is going to do a lot more damage. I modeled how much damage that was going to do. So how do I do that? Well, it says 220% weapon damage. I assume that weapon damage was the base damage of my weapon with a dexterity bonus. It does not account for criticals, so I cannot crit with a kick. And I basically just take 2.2 times my dexterity modifier and my base damage modifier, and I should get what my kick damage is. Let's go ahead and go back to just the staff, right? And so I get rid of my dexterity bonus. So if I have my staff, my kick is doing 42 damage every time I land it. Now, across the course long term, if I don't have any spirit regeneration, I can only land a kick after I do 5 attacks, because I generate 6 spirit per attack, right? And, lash and tail kick costs 30, so I can punch somebody 5 times, then I can consume that 30 spirit with a kick, and that will keep my spirit up. If I do any more kicks than that, like a kick every 4 attacks, eventually I'm going to run out of spirit, and I'll have to wait. So I just basically said, long term, I can do 5 hits and then land a kick and see how much damage that does. For the staff, I modeled that like this. I said, okay, I'm basically going to do 5 attacks with my staff, and I'm going to land a kick. Right? So 5 attacks with this, land a kick. And I said that there's this multiplier on the kick because it's an AoE attack. That means that I'm going to attack actually 1.5 times the number of enemies. So if I were to normally hit like 3 enemies with a punch, I'd probably hit 5 enemies with a kick. I mean, this is an AoE attack too, right? It's just not as good as this one, right? So I just assumed that the kick was going to do 50% more. It's going to hit 50% more targets than a punch. So now if I add that into my DPS calculation, so I do 5 punches, and then I kick, and I do an additional 50% with that. So instead of 40 damage, that kick is probably going to do 60. And I divide it by the amount of time that it took for me to land those 5 attacks. In the case of the staff, it takes about 5 seconds to do that, because it's about 1.04 attacks per second, a little bit less than 1 second per attack. And then I added a second for the kick. I figure a kick takes about a second. So that makes my DPS number 28.23. So it's way higher than the 20.74 that you would see with my staff. So because I'm kicking, I'm doing more damage. You need to take that into account. Now, I also modeled out what it would be like if I landed 6 punches and then I kicked, just to see if more punches was better or worse. And it turns out that if I punch more often with my staff, I'd actually do less damage, and that's because my kick damage is so high. I need to be kicking every available cooldown, or in this case, every available time that I have the spirit available to use it, because it does so much more damage than just whacking them with my stick. So, that's how it works with the staff. With the dual wielding, it's a little bit more complicated, because I am assuming that it takes the weapon damage of the next weapon available in your dual wield attack pattern. So, what does that mean? So if I'm standing here, I'm going to go cudgel, knuckles, cudgel, knuckles with each attack, right? So I do 1 attack. That's a cudgel attack. It's a knuckles attack. Cudgel, knuckles, cudgel, knuckles. My next attack would be a cudgel. But if I do a lash and tail kick instead, it'll do 220 weapon damage, 220% weapon damage. And the weapon damage in this case would be the cudgel's weapon damage, because the cudgel is the next thing that I would attack with. So that makes it complicated. My cudgel kick damage, so the kick damage that I would do if the cudgel was the base damage I would be using, is 32. In the case of the knuckles, since my base damage is much lower, it'd be 18. So if I do 5 hits, right, 5 hits would be cudgel, knuckle, cudgel, knuckle, cudgel. My next attack would be my 6th attack, my kick, would be based off the knuckle damage. So that was a knuckle kick. Knuckle kick does 18 damage, right? So my DPS is calculated like this. Get rid of that guy. My DPS is like this. So I do 3 hits with my cudgel, 2 hits with my knuckle, and then I do a kick based off the knuckle damage, and I divide it by the time it takes for me to land 5 hits with my cudgel and my knuckle, 3 cudgels, 2 knuckles, and then I add a second for the kick, 20.541. Abysmal. Way less than 28.23. And ironically enough, if I do a 6-hit kick here, contrary to the case with the staff, I'm actually doing more damage, because now I'm using the cudgel-based damage for my kick, because I went cudgel, knuckle, cudgel, knuckle, cudgel, knuckle, cudgel kick. So, what does this all mean? It all means that the primary thing that's really driving my damage right now is base damage. How do I model that? Well, I put this thing right here. This is a damage bonus. Let's say I had a weapon that, or some item that gave me an additional +1 base damage to my weapons. Let's take a look at the DPS increase for that, right? So if I get 1 additional base damage, I go from 20.54 to 23.29. That's ginormous. That is a huge increase. Let me make sure this guy's right. 8 and 1.4. Right, so that's a huge increase in my damage. I went from 22.918 to 26. Same thing here. Why is this guy all weird? Why are you weird? Oh, right, because I'm not doing this. 0. Oops, yeah. Go back here. Sorry. So 0 is, oh boy, I'm messing all sorts of things up here. 1.4, that is right. Great. So if I add 1 damage, so I go from 23 to 26, right? 23, 26, over a 10% increase. Here, if I added 1 base damage, I go from 28 to 30, right? So it's a huge damage increase there. Let's say I add 1 dexterity instead, right? I get a much more piddly damage increase, right? 23.6 to 23.8. The reason for that is that my base damage is driving most of my damage output right now. Kicks are the things that are doing the most damage, and my base damage, the higher that gets, the more percentage I'm going to increase my ability to attack, because my base damage right now is so low. What's interesting is if I dual wield and I get an additional 10 base damage, now my dual wielding is starting to overtake my my two-handed weapon. This is because base damage applies to every attack that I do, and I do more attacks when I'm dual wielding. So I get the speed bonus and my weapons are faster. So I get to use this 10 damage bonus much more often. So as I start to get more and more base damage, dual wielding is probably going to get better. But right now, in the lower limit, where I have very low base damage, I need to make that guy bigger way, way fast. And I need to worry about dexterity later. Dexterity is not going to give me a lot of damage output right now. And that's good news, because that means I can focus on armor. So in this particular case, I should probably not worry about this 18 armor 4 dexterity guy, because it's not going to do much for me from a survivability standpoint, and it's not really going to do that much from a damage standpoint. This is going to make it much easier for me to survive. So, a bunch of cool stuff in there. I figured out what skill I want to use. So I want to keep using this Lashing Tail Kick because it does a lot of damage. And I need to get better weapons so that my base damage goes up. For now, I'm going to do the two-handed weapon right now, just because it has such high base damage. But if I can, I would like to find one-handed weapons like this Cudgel that have between 10 and 15 damage. That would be super, super awesome. So one thing about this that was really interesting to me is that even though I did all that modeling in this number, I got a model to make that number appear. I don't see me using the weapons here. And it's claiming, for example, right now, it's claiming that I do an attack, 1.4 attacks per second. But clearly that third attack it takes longer, right? It takes longer than my other attacks. It's clear, I can just see it, so I don't know what's going on. I don't know how much I can trust this number. But for now, I'm just going to kind of go with it. One interesting thing that I tried is I went into battle. So let's go maybe here. This is a good place to go. And if you change your skill, it goes on cooldown, right? Except now I'm on cooldown. So because I'm on cooldown, I can see me using my weapons, right? So that's interesting. I don't know if that changes things, but I will need to do more research on that. And I've been going at this a couple hours already, so I kind of want to just get back to smashing faces. And I got some pretty good conclusions out of it so far. But that's interesting. That's something that I think I would need to look into a little bit more. So, yeah, that was basically my findings and what I went through. It was kind of a long video, but I think it was pretty useful. And if you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, just leave some comments, and I will try to go more in depth into some of the mechanics that I find interesting. And I'll also probably come back to that model as I get cooler items, just to see which things are going to do more damage for me. But for now, it's going to be the two-handed weapon, Lashing Tail Kick, and I will start to analyze these skills at some point in the future, too. So, yeah, again, that's Tanoy Sinha here, just doing a little bit of mechanics overview. This is a Diablo 3 playthrough. I'm going to get back to smashing faces. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys soon.